Hello and welcome to this online lecture for week 12 of the Philosophy of Mind course that I'm running at LaGuardia Community College. My name is Dr. Richard Brown, and I'd like to welcome you to what will most likely be the final lecture for this class. Excuse me. One of the benefits of being a biological creature on the planet currently is the development of antihistamines or histamines in one's body. So currently allergy season's full swing here in New York, so I'm suffering through there. I'll try not to sneeze too much on you, but anyway, I would like to welcome you to this final lecture for this class on consciousness and the technological singularity. So you may remember that last week we were discussing artificial intelligence and the computational theory of mind. And we ended looking at John Searle's argument from Minds, Brains, and Programs that you cannot have, in any real sense, artificially intelligent agents. And David Chalmers, who we've met previously in this class, he's a major advocate for dualism. David Chalmers has argued that artificial intelligence will happen. And so this is an argument he gives in a recent paper of his called The Singularity, a Philosophical Analysis. So the argument's quite interesting, I think. It's fairly simple. Here's the first premise. It says that the human brain is a machine. And we're going to talk in more about these terms that he uses here in a second. So that's the first premise, though. The human brain is a machine. The second premise is that we will have the capacity to emulate this machine before too long. The third premise is if we emulate this machine, then we will have artificial intelligence. The conclusion from these premises is that unless there's some kind of defeater, there will be artificial intelligence before too long. Okay, so now why doesn't this argument fall prey to the kinds of Sanskrit room, syntax semantics, original intentionality, all of that stuff that we talked about? Well, let's look a little more closely at what's going on here. So the word machine is a very general word. So in its most general, a machine simply is a system, a tool of some kind, but really a tool just is a device for doing a job. So it's a system that uses energy to produce an intended action or goal. So now one kind of machine is a mechanical machine, a machine that human beings have built. Another kind of machine might be a computational machine, like a Turing machine. So we've talked about sort of classical notions of machines, but there's no sense in which that's the only kind of machine. In its most general sense, it's just a thing which does something. It uses energy, and clearly the brain is doing that. So Chalmers' claim here is simply that the brain is a machine. And machines can be emulated by other machines. So an emulation, this is a term from computer science. An emulation is a computational system that duplicates the behavior of another computational system. And so we've already talked a little bit about emulation. Emulation is a kind of simulation, but it's a very, you might say it's a distinct kind of simulation. So we'll talk about what's distinct about it in just a second. But we looked at this already when we looked at Turing machines, and we talked about a universal Turing machine. So a universal Turing machine is simply a programmable computer in one sense. And what that means is that it can simulate any kind of Turing machine, because remember, Turing machines are built to do certain computations. And so a universal Turing machine is simply one that can simulate any Turing machine. It can do any computation that's computable by a Turing machine. So emulation is this kind of duplicating the behavior of the other kind of system. And it's important that we use emulation here and not simply the word simulation, because simulation sometimes is used to mean simply modeling. So you can simulate a hurricane or a wind tunnel, but you have not produced the behavior of a wind tunnel or a hurricane. You've simulated the behavior of that thing, but you haven't reproduced it. Whereas an emulation actually does the same thing. So if you emulate a hurricane, you've produced a hurricane. So the idea here is that we'll be able to emulate, if the brain is a machine, we'll be able to emulate it, which is to build another machine which does the same, performs the same work, the same job. Now notice that this is a very general claim. Now we've looked at some specific ideas on how to implement this very general claim, and that was what we looked at last week when we talked about Turing machines and the computational theory of mind and good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. But Chalmers is very clear that, at least in his mind, he's not assuming that the brain is doing anything like classical computation. I mean, maybe it is, but then again, maybe it's not. There are other kinds of computation and other forms of computational systems besides the classical kind that Turing and others have studied in mathematics and in traditional cognitive science. So we won't even mention kind of quantum computing, although that's on the horizon here, and people shouldn't keep an eye on that. And of course, by the way, the parenthetical thing is important because Chalmers is also clear that, look, it may turn out that it's not computation at all. That's just our best guess right now. But maybe it's not. It's simply because, you can have non-computational machines, perhaps. And so if the brain could still be a machine, it could still be emulated even if it wasn't doing computations. But in general, computation seems important. And it's important to point out that the kind of computation we talked about last week is not the only game in town. And so I'll just briefly mention two computers in this area because they're interesting and important. So one of them is computer science. One of them is a theory called connectionism. And connectionism comes from computer science, and it's a kind of computation that's supposed to be more like what a neuron does. So if you look over here on the right, this is kind of a diagram of a neural network. And you can see that down on the bottom there are inputs. Each circle, W, X, Y, and Z, is an input neuron. And they call them neurons because these are neural networks, artificial neural networks. So you have these input neurons, and these nodes are preferentially activated. So they're activated by something. We could say perhaps this is activated by verbs, and W is activated by nouns, and Y is activated by adjectives. Or it could be straight lines, diagonal lines. I mean, it could be anything. So they're activated by something. And then those activations are connected to other nodes. And there you see the output neuron there, N at the top. And you can see that each one of these connections is weighted. So if W is activated, then you get a 0.5 weight. Whereas if X is activated, you get a 1.5 weight. And so if you look at N, the threshold thing up there, that N thing is going to fire when the total activation equals 4. So you could calculate how many of these you need to activate in which order in order to get that N neuron there to fire. And these weights can be adjusted by training. So if W gets activated a lot, that might get a higher weight. Depending on the environment, so that these things are not static, but they're sort of dynamic and adjustable in response to the kinds of things that are going on here. And then, of course, I've already mentioned this. You have the output thing there, and the output will respond only at a given threshold. And again, that threshold can be adjusted in a similar way as the weights can be adjusted. So now this kind of neural network here, a very simple one, more like what a brain does. Notice that there's nothing here which looks like Turing machine computation. And connectionists are often saying things like that. This is not your old-fashioned kind of computing over symbols, because there's no symbols here. They're just nodes connected and the weights between them. Now, you could go back and look at the earlier lecture on this, and I gave you some example of this, how a brain might implement a kind of function. And I do think that we can see a confluence of these, because you might have an old-fashioned symbolic system implemented connectionally, and maybe that is what's going on here. But nonetheless, many people think that connectionist systems are very different. And notice that they think that it's more like what the brain is doing in any case. And we can compare it to what we talked about when we talked about long-term potentiation in the functionalism lecture in particular. So remember that we're trying to give an account of learning in that lecture, and we sort of give a definition of learning in behavioral terms. Learning is the process via which experience changes behavior. So then we look in the brain, we discover long-term potentiation, we find out that really what's going on, these chemicals come in, they change the weighting and firing of and sensitivity of these various neurons, which changes their responsiveness, which then cements certain experiential changes. So machine learning, excuse me, pattern recognition and machine learning is a version of this. And this is what, we have these, we use these all the time, these pattern recognizers. And by the way, in brain science, these kind of pattern recognition programs are getting very interesting results, whereby some people are saying we're able to get more information using multivariate pattern analysis than we could from just regular kinds of fMRI. And if you would look at the lecture by Colin Clifford from Consciousness Online, you'll see a very nice introduction to multivariate pattern analysis and the kinds of programs that they're using to do that research are these kind of machine learning algorithms. They're simply neural networks that are generic, and you can train them to do various tasks. So there's an actual computer program which you run it, you give it some data, and the weights get adjusted, and then the computer program comes and then gives it more and compares. And of course, this only works if you know what you're looking for. You tell it, look for this, and you give it some samples, and then it gives it some feedback, and you train up this system to learn. And so Chalmers is making the point that, look, if you don't like classical computation, this kind of machine learning is interesting, and if really you could debate whether it's implementing representations and symbolic transformations over those representations governed by rules and this kind of thing, and that's an interesting debate to have. But at either case, this is a kind of computation, and it is perfectly fine that if what we do is emulate the brain, we can do it this way. So it need not be the kind of old-fashioned architecture that we've been looking at in the previous lectures. And then I'll just mention one other approach here, because I like this approach and I think it's important. This is sometimes the approach that's called computational neuroscience. So remember that in the functionalism lecture, we talked about the idea of whether the brain was a digital computer or could be thought of in terms of digital computation. And one of the things that we said was, yeah, it does seem that way, because these neurons either fire or they don't. And so it looks like you have a kind of binary on-off type thing. And binary is very useful for encoding this kind of information and doing computations in this Turing way. And so it looks like maybe there's a connection there. But then again, what many people have pointed out, and what you may have already been thinking to yourself if you watched those earlier lectures, is that the brain does seem to be a continuous system, at least in the sense that it's modeled by differential equations. So the Hodgson-Huxley equations that we looked at in those earlier lectures are differential equations, and differential equations model how something evolves over time in a continuous manner. That's right. The dx over dt part of the differential equation is a continuous function. So it looks to be very different than the kind of static binary on-off type thing that you get in the firing. It looks like we have a system which is evolving continuously over time. And so some people have said, well, what we need is a kind of hybrid model. It's not completely digital, it's not completely analog, but that there's some kind of weird mixture. And then people have their interesting debates about what shape an actual theory of this kind would take. And of course, we're not here to do that. we're here to sort of gesture in this area and point out that, there are many paths to AI. Good old-fashioned AI, symbolic Turing machine type AI. It's not dead in the water, but it's only one path, whether you think it's fruitful or not. And so I'll just mention some actual stuff that's people are trying to do, some actual projects. The most exciting probably is the Human Brain Project. And this sort of comes out of work called the Blue Brain Project, which you may have heard of or you may not have heard of. But the idea is to take the supercomputers that we have. I think the Blue Gene computer, the Blue Genie or something like that is called, most powerful computer we have available right now. And of course, the power of that is growing, according to Moore's law, at least for now, where computational power is growing exponentially, and that's cool. So, some people say we'll be able to actually do this. So, I mean, I've heard people say as early as 2029. I've heard other people speculate it could be later, 2050. Some people are very optimistic about this. But here's a quote from the website of the Human Brain Project. They say, quote, "The challenge in artificial intelligence is to design algorithms that can produce intelligent behavior and to use them to build intelligent machines. It doesn't matter whether the algorithms are biologically realistic. What matters is that they work, the behavior they produce. In the Human Brain Project, we're doing something completely different. The goal is to build data-driven models that capture what we've learned about the brain experimentally. It's deep mechanics, the bottom-up approach, and the basic principles it uses in cognition, the top-down approach. Certainly, we will try and translate our results into technology, neuromorphic processors. This is something that they're actually trying to do. But unlike classical AI, we will base the technology on what we actually know about the brain and its circuitry, end quote. So this is a very interesting project based in Switzerland. And, they've already simulated one neocortical structure, a column, which if some people say is the basic computational unit of the cortex, these columns. And of course, so what they're doing is different than the connectionist stuff that we were just looking at, because the connectionists are sort of, they're inspired by the brain, but they leave a lot of the details out. And they sort of go, okay, it's just these connections that matter and the weights between them. Whereas the other stuff was looking at, the symbols that are manipulated by rules. So these guys are kind of looking at both, and they want to look at actual brain data and really model the data, like build a thing which does what the neurons do in the way that neurons do it. And their goal is to actually do this for an entire human brain. And so someday they'll have this giant computer system. This is their goal. I mean, whether it will work or not remains to be seen. But their goal is to emulate the machinery of the brain, whatever it's doing. They don't even, they have some ideas about spiking and synchrony and, all of the stuff, the data that we're getting from neuroscience. They're consolidating it and try to build something which does that, reproduce that behavior, emulate that machine. And their idea roughly is that, let's speculate the 2029, they do this and they turn it on, and then, they ask it questions. What's going on? How do you feel today? What's your name? And they want to see if it's going to be artificially intelligent. So another, again, a way to bring out Chalmers' point is, yes, that's one way of doing it. Build a computer program and from the ground up. Another way to do it is, hey, look, the brain sort of does it. We know that. So let's see what happens if we reproduce what the brain does. This is an active area of research. And then I'll just mention one other way. I wish I could show some videos. And I know there's a way to go on YouTube and get videos that are on YouTube and put them in your video that's on YouTube. And, okay, maybe I'll do that someday. But what's really an interesting avenue here, in which some people are really exploring, is to exploit evolution. So if you are someone, and David Chalmers certainly is someone like this, if you are someone who who thinks that evolution, unguided by anything, just happened to produce creatures like us with consciousness and minds. Well, and by the way, that's a dumb process, unguided. Now, of course, some people think, God has to guide it. And, Chalmers isn't one of those people. And a lot of people aren't those people. So this argument is geared towards them. If evolution could do it on its own, well, then why can't we do it? And of course, then you might be able to say the other thing too. Well, look, if God guided evolution, then maybe we could try to guide it too and guide some artificial evolution. And of course, I would be accused of playing God, the ultimate playing God there. But of course, you know, the goal is to produce an artificially intelligent agent. So simulated evolution works very well for these kinds of machine learning techniques that we've been talking about. And like I said, I would show a video of this, but you can see that there are some robotics labs that are now working in this way, trying to teach computers, like iCub, for instance, is one. You can Google that. One that tries to learn like a human child learns. And then there are other more simpler systems. If you want to teach a system how to navigate around an environment to a power source, which would extend this little robot's duration of activity, and it has to learn the environment where the power source is. Well, you can build a system and put it in this environment and it'll fail, but then you put a system that has that information, the next iteration, next generation. And over time, it hits on the best solution to this. And I wish I could show this video. There's a really great video of this, of a system learning how to do this. And it's simply done by having multiple generations of this system that's learning from its own past experience. The past experience of previous versions of itself. So there are many, many roots to artificial intelligence, and it doesn't take but a quick perusal to look at the Google car that drives itself. You can search Big Dog and look at what Big Dog is doing. We have these advanced robotic systems which are capable of intelligent seeming behaviors on their own. They haven't passed the Turing test quite yet, but they're getting very sophisticated. And then, of course, you find out that Google is hiring all these people. Google just bought Boston Dynamics, the big company here that's making all these things. And they hired Ray Kurzweil and a bunch of these other computer scientist genius types. And they're sort of starting the Manhattan Project of AI. And the goal is to sort of produce this. So multiple avenues are working on artificial intelligence. And whatever you're feeling about Searle's argument, you have to ask yourself, what's going to happen when we turn on this simulated brain if we're able to do it? Because who knows whether it's just doing computation or not. If it's doing exactly what the brain is doing, then it should produce exactly the same results, or at least that's the guiding idea. So now, that's Chalmers' argument for the existence of artificial intelligence. Forget whether it's Turing computation. If the brain is simply a device of any kind, then we can build something which does what it does in some way. And so and we're doing it. We're working very seriously, very hard towards this direction. So it's gonna happen at some point, unless there are defeaters. And so we'll talk about those defeaters, or what kind of defeaters they could be in a second. But so that's just the argument to artificial intelligence. The next step is from there to the technological singularity. So the technological singularity is a term, I think, popularized by Ray Kurzweil, but I don't really know, and I'm not sure. But a singularity is just a non-repeatable event, and that's why people call the Big Bang a singularity, because we don't have the tools to explain it or understand it's a singular thing. Black holes maybe the same thing. Okay. So in this sense, the technological singularity is supposed to get to the idea of when we design a machine which surpasses us in intelligence. So, we're already doing pretty good in that direction. We have machines that can beat us in chess. This is Deep Blue, beat the world chess champion. That's famous. But of course, Deep Blue can't do very much else. It's just good at doing chess, but it can't, it can't pass a freshman class in philosophy. Then, of course, we have Watson, the computer that did beat people on Jeopardy. And, of course, Watson is just searching a big database, and it doesn't seem all that fancy. But the idea is this, is if we get AI, then we're going to have AI plus. And AI plus for Chalmers is artificial intelligence that's smarter than human beings. And so you can see already if there's machine learning, and if these things learn how to, the principles by which they are themselves designed, then they would be probably better at designing better versions of themselves. And we're already using these kinds of intelligent algorithms and so forth to design better machines that make better cars. You know, these mechanical arms, which make your GMs or whatever, Ford, whichever companies are trying to come back from bankruptcy recently, these giant mechanical arms are mostly produced by other machines. And the idea is if we have artificial intelligence, it'll figure out how to improve itself. And if it figures out how to improve itself, then it will figure out how to improve that improved version of itself. That's AI plus plus. So AI plus plus is super intelligence. It's the kind of intelligence that makes ours look minuscule. And so, you know, you can imagine various versions of this, but one version of it is that this thing becomes so intelligent that by comparison, we seem like dogs, simple-minded, sweet things, but not on the same level of understanding, or even worse, like ants, which, you know, behavior is so alien to these things that we can't relate to them at all. So there are various worries that happen here. And of course, as soon as you start thinking about this, you should worry about the singularity, because if there is this kind of event, it will profoundly impact human life. So if Chalmers is right, that if we get to an artificial intelligence, which seems inevitable unless there are some stoppers to it, then we're going to hit the singularity. You might ask yourself whether we should allow this kind of super intelligence. And many people feel that we shouldn't. All you have to do is take a casual glance at literature, you know, from any time in history, and you find some version of something like a Frankenstein story where technology runs amok and we try to produce something that ultimately gets us. And the Terminator, of course, is my favorite version of this. I happen to have a little interest in the Terminator, those of you who know me. And of course, this is just the latest, greatest version of this age-old story that we build something that then becomes quicker, faster, smarter than us, and then sees us as its threat. So some people think that this is kind of inevitable, that if you get these hyper-intelligent, super-intelligent machines, that they will enslave us in the way that we enslave other simpler, sweeter animals around us. And some people see that as pessimistic, but of course, if you look at the way we treat other less intelligent species on our own planet, there's precedent for that. And so I do think this is a legitimate worry, although some people optimistically think that these hyper-intelligent beings, if there are any such possible at all, that they would be more benevolent because of their super intelligence. But of course, that's speculation of the highest degree by beings like us who are less than hyper intelligent. So some people worry whether we should allow it at all. And of course, Chalmers spends a great deal of time discussing the possibilities here, leak-proof AI, where you build it in an environment where it doesn't know about the outside world. You keep it isolated. And of course, you can think about the Matrix here. So the Matrix was a problem because there was a way to get out of the Matrix. Now, of course, if you watch the whole stupid series, you find out that it was designed that way on purpose and blah, blah, blah. But abstracting from the details of the particular bad plot of that series, you can see the basic idea that if you were interested in building this kind of super AI, you might want to have it isolated in a virtual environment that couldn't leak out into the actual environment. So there are interesting questions there that we can talk about. Now, of course, related here is questions of whether we can integrate in some way with the superintelligence. So neural prosthetics, for instance, can we ourselves become hyperintelligence? Can we extend our own machinery if these beings have mastered their principles of their own design, then possibly they could master the principles of our design. If we are machines in any sense, then it's possible, we might be able to become post-human singularitarians. Chalmers speculates we might even be able to upload our own consciousness. So some people see, rather than a bleak, dismal future of Terminators dominating human beings in some post-apocalyptic sci-fi world, other people see a post-human utopia where we integrate with machinery to become better versions of ourselves, truly transcending our animal nature in the highest possible sense of that term, becoming more than our biological nature allows us to be. So now, whether this is possible or not, of course, is a subject of great debate. And Chalmers actually argues that it is possible, and he offers an actual argument. And that's one of the nice things about his work, is that he doesn't simply speculate, oh, is it possible? Let's go watch Transcendence and watch Johnny Depp become a computer program. But he's actually got an argument which suggests that that something like the Transcendence scenario is actually allowable given our laws of physics. So he does this by introducing the idea of what he calls an organizational invariant. So here's what he says. He says, quote, in general, if a property is not an organizational invariant, we should not expect it to be preserved in a computer simulation. A simulated rainstorm is not wet, for instance. But if a property is an organizational invariant, we should expect it to be preserved in a computer simulation. A simulated computer is a computer, end quote. So this is a quote from his talk, Simulation and Singularity, and I think that's at DeSalle University there, but he gave this talk in many places, and it ultimately was published as The Singularity of Philosophical Analysis. So the basic idea here is that some properties, if you simulate them, you don't get the same property in the simulation. And so, as he says, a simulated rainstorm is not wet. But other things, if you simulate them, you get the thing. And his example is a computer. And we know already from our discussion that if you simulate a computer, you get another computer. There's no difference between having a computer and simulating a computer. That's, we used that word earlier, emulation. When you simulate a computer, you're emulating that thing, and it is actually computing those functions in the same way that it would if it weren't being emulated. So now the big question then is whether consciousness is itself an organizational invariant. So this is a debate between what I call biologicalism and computationalism. So some people think that consciousness is an organizational invariant. And so that if we were uploaded into a virtual environment, we could have conscious experience of something at least of the same kind that we do right now. Whereas other people believe that consciousness depends on the biological properties of the brain, like, for example, perhaps the biochemical or bioelectrical properties. And you can go back and look at the mind-brain identity theory there, because many people who hold this biological view are identity theorists. So this question, it's important to notice, is independent of the question of whether consciousness is physical or not physical, whether panpsychism is true, or whether proto-Russellian monism, or any of those other kind of views. All of that stuff is independent of this kind of question. So you could have physicalists who think that computers could experience consciousness in just the same way we do. And these are usually functionalist people. So, if your view is simply that consciousness is a functional property, and if you build a robot or android or whatever, and it functions in exactly the same way, then functionalists are going to say, yeah, that thing is conscious just like us. But they could still be physicalists, because, they might say, well, it has to be something physical arranged in the right way. You don't get non-physical ghosts with consciousness on their view. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, what about dualists? Well, but dualists can simply accept that there are laws connecting consciousness to organization. And this is what Chalmers does. So Chalmers is a dualist, at least in the sense that he thinks that substance dualism is an open possibility, and he thinks that epiphenomenalism is an open possibility, and he thinks that something like Russellian monism is an open possibility. And nonetheless, he thinks that in our actual world, given the way this world is set up in the physics of our world, that there are fundamental laws which connect organization or function to consciousness. So he thinks, yes, consciousness is separate, but that what it's connected to in our world is organization, not simply biology. Now, the argument that he gives for this are his dancing and fading qualia arguments. So over on the right here, we have our little circuit diagram of a neuron that we get from the Hodgkin-Huxley model. Okay, and there are more fancy versions of this, but this is just, to aid the imagination. So imagine building an artificial neuron. Suppose, and if you like the Human Brain Project version of it better, then imagine that version of it. But the idea here is imagine something is not, there's no biological things. It's just circuits and resistors, but it does exactly what a neuron does. Now imagine that, you can have that replaced. Take a neuron and this little circuit replaces that. Sort of, the way that you can have a hair transplant or an organ transplant, you have a whole set of these things replaced. So now we can imagine a series of steps. So in step 1, you're totally biological. In step 2, you have one artificial neuron. In step 3, you have 2 artificial neurons. In step N, you have N artificial neurons, and all the way through to where you have all artificial neurons. So now we have this series. And of course, there are various options. So some people say, well, look, at some point, through this series, perhaps your consciousness is growing dimmer. It's gradually fading, like a light on a dimmer switch. And the more of your biological brain gets replaced with non-biological circuitry, you sort of have this descending amount of consciousness, dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. That's what we're going to call fading qualia. Okay, so now here's the process: D1, D2 through D whatever. DF is where it's totally faded. Okay, so now take a moment at DF. That's where your consciousness has faded to the point where it's like almost non-existent, but still there, but just very faint. Now, of course, since these circuits, now let's assume that this happened to David Chalmers, and there's a picture of him there singing his famous zombie blues. So he's hearing the sounds of the blues, and he's hearing that, and he's shouting, I act like you act, and all of that stuff. And so, but he believes that he's having this very loud, there's loud rock and roll music, the blues is happening, he's shouting, it's all very loud and extreme. And of course, I have a video of that on my YouTube channel, so you can go check that out, the zombie blues, if you're interested in that. But imagine, that's a very distinctive experience listening to the zombie blues. So he believes that he's having this experience, but of course, what's actually happening, according to the hypothesis, is that conscious experience is very faded at this point. Now that's very weird because the subject can't notice it. These little neurons are doing all the same stuff. So if this neuron is busy producing behavior like, moving the lips and expelling gases from the oral cavity, which result in you hearing the sounds, I act like you act, then that neuron is still in the business of doing that. So that behavior is still produced. And in fact, all of the same behaviors are produced. There's no room here for you to suddenly go, holy moly, my consciousness is faded, because that would mean that the neurons weren't doing exactly the same thing, but they are by stipulation, so you can't notice. But if there's anything that seems central, it seems that in normal circumstances, when we judge that we're having conscious experience, we're right about that. So it would just be, if the world we live in is one where you could be having this faded experience that's almost like not having any experience at all, and yet believe that you're having some very intense experience, then we have a very strange relationship to our own conscious experience. Now, that's not a logical contradiction, because there are possible worlds, Chalmers believes, where this stuff happens. And you can go back onto the dualism lecture and look at the view about possible worlds and blah blah blah. But there is a world where this is happening, where the Chalmers there has 9/10 of his brain replaced by circuitry and has a very faded experience. Now Chalmers says the laws of physics are different there. That's what's different. But if our world is like that, then we live in this really crazy world. So, but there is a world where the law connects it in the right way. So this seems like evidence that we're in that world. So the argument here is that the best explanation of what's going on is that the laws of physics don't allow that partial zombie faded world to exist. And Chalmers concludes from this that in the actual world, the property of being conscious is an organizational invariant. So that while it's still possible that it fades, the best answer to the question, what's happening in this process of gradual replacement of neurons, Chalmers claims the best answer is that consciousness stays the same. And that at the end, when you have a brain that's completely composed of artificial neurons, that you are still conscious. And remember, the sense of consciousness here is phenomenal consciousness. You can go back and check on that lecture. Remember, that's why all those things are there, so that we can use these terms freely. And then if you're confused by what we mean by them, we have an hour discussion of what we mean by them. So what we mean here is that there's something that it's like for you. So Chalmers' claim is that if you were to have your brain completely replaced by these digital neurons, these artificial neurons, whether they're digital or not, I guess I shouldn't beg that question, but these artificial neurons, if you were to have them completely replaced, his claim is that there would still be something that it was like for you to hear this music and perform in this group and so forth. Now, of course, for all of this argument shows, what it's like for you could be very different, because all that the claim that is being made here is that consciousness, in the sense of that there is something that it's like, the subjective character, if you like those terms that we developed earlier in this class. The subjective character is the same according to Chalmers. But how do we know the phenomenal character is the same? How do we know that, the experience of your is the same after your brain's been replaced? Complaced, that's replaced with a computer, complaced. So how do we know that? Well, this is where the dancing qualia argument is supposed to come in. And of course, dancing qualia is a great name for a band. But here, the idea of a dancing qualia is one that blinks in and out. So it's dancing in the sense of, there it is, now it's on, off, on, off. So we can imagine, remember, we're imagining this, again, here's this David Chalmers singing the zombie blues. And there's a series all the way from completely biological to completely digital, or excuse me, completely artificial. And we've picked an arbitrary point here. And now what we do is instead of at this point it being faded, we're doing dancing. And what dancing is, you see this little input-output arrow between the brain here and this circuitry. We're flipping it on and off. So this idea is, imagine, well, what happens is at some point, it just disappears completely. Whether it's faded out to the point where it's completely, or it's just like it was full blown and all of a sudden it's just gone when you replace neuron number n+1 or whatever. Then what we're doing now is flipping it, the crucial neuron, biological, artificial, biological, artificial, biological, artificial. So now at this moment, the subject here believes they're hearing this loud music, but really it's flipping in and out. I'm not doing a very good job of it, but you get the idea. But again, there can be no behavioral differences because the neurons are doing all the same thing. So, the sound is really going, and yet you believe it's continuous and that you're hearing the sound, act like you act, and and all of that stuff. So again, this is very weird. And again, the idea is not that there are no possible worlds where this happens, because Chalmers believes there is a possible world where this happens. But he claims there is also a possible world. So the difference is that they're the laws that connect consciousness to the organization. In one of the possible world, it's weird and has this sort of variable connection where it bounces in and out. In another world, it's stable and connects them reliably for the most part. And so the claim is, what's our actual world like? And his claim is, well, given the experience we have, the best explanation of the actual world is that it's the reliable one, that there's laws that connect organization to these contents of consciousness. So now this gets you the bigger result. This gets you the idea that not only is it the case that there's something that it's like for the digital variant of you at the other end of this process, that when you come to the fully digital brain, the fully artificial brain. I guess I keep saying digital because of the original article where he talks about this. He talks about Digi-Dave. He talked about the biological Dave, and then the artificial one that's fully got these neurons there, he calls Digi-Dave. And of course digital, but we're expanding now past digital computation. So it's simply artificial Dave, Artie Dave. So the Artie Dave at the end there, not only is there something that it's like for this completely artificial brained creature to hear the music, but Chalmers' claim is we can rest assured that it's exactly like what it is originally for the biological version to experience it. Because otherwise, we would be living in one of these worlds where there are these very weird laws, these very non-parsimonious, very strange kinds of laws, which say that there's kind of a random or variable connection between organization and consciousness. And that just seems to fly in the face of all of our ordinary experience. And in most of the cases, they're just like, it seems that we have a pretty good relationship with our conscious experience. And this would be upsetting that. And we have no good reason to believe that the world is like this, according to Chalmers. And so the best result here is to endorse computationalism as opposed to biologicalism. Now, okay, so we can't upload yet, and the movie Transcendence is merely fictional, but people talk about various uploading. And it looks like we're going to be doing it in stages here, probably. And so Chalmers likes to appeal to what he calls partial uploading as a more kind of realistic way of easing our way into these science fiction scenarios. So partial uploading is just the idea that you have a small part of the neural stuff digitized or artificialized. So we're already doing that. We have prosthetic limbs that you can connect up, and people can control. And we're getting more and more sophisticated versions of these kinds of things, of machine and brain interfaces. And there are even examples now of cochlear implants, where you put something in the ear that's artificial, and it takes sound waves and transfers them into the right kinds of electrical signals, and then it hooks up with the regular architecture of the brain, and then you hear sounds. So we're already getting this kind of stuff, and Chalmers envisions that if this continues, it shouldn't be too long before we have people walking around with partially artificial neural systems. Maybe it's low level at first, like we put a retina, then we can mess with the optical nerve, and then maybe we get to a point where parts of the lateral nucleus, can be artificially replaced, or who knows, maybe small parts of the auditory cortex you can implant these crude circuits in there, maybe, that restore partial hearing. I mean, you can imagine this happening. People are working on this now, so it's not too far-fetched that you get grandma of the year 2035 has a hip replacement and also a hearing aid implant, some kind of neural architecture thing implanted that allows her to hear better. And Chalmers' idea is, if grandma comes home and she was deaf when she went to the hospital, and she comes home from the hospital, and you say, "Hey, grandma," and she says, "Oh, Jimmy, so good to hear your voice. I haven't heard your voice in a long time." it's not like the average person's going to say, Grandma, you're a zombie. You don't really have conscious experience of my voice. You have a computer implant and you lack that conscious experience. So, I mean, the basic idea is when people are walking around with these things, it was going to be an open philosophical possibility that they kind of lack conscious experience, but it's going to be, relegated to the kinds of weirdness that people say, like, oh, how do you know that we're not dreaming right now? And yeah, of course, that's a vague possibility that we're not dreaming, that we are dreaming right now, but no one really takes it seriously, that this is kind of some giant dream, like Inception type scenario. So even though that's a possibility, we kind of just ignore it because real life, seems so real. And Chalmers' idea is, yeah, it's going to be like that. People are going to be walking around. They're going to have these artificial implants, little partial implants, and they're going to be functioning in normal. And so it's just going to be like, it's going to be sort of absurd to say they don't have conscious experience. Now, we haven't got to that point yet, but even so, there would be an issue, I think, and this is something we can talk about, but there still would be an issue about whether the rest of the brain is sort of taking over and filling in, doing some kind of plasticity thing where the artificial thing may be implanting or inputting some kind of information, but then the real brain is providing the consciousness juice. But who knows? I think it will be interesting to keep our eye on this. So that's the partial uploading. Now we can sort of bring this full circle by looking at something called the simulation argument, which claims that maybe we're already uploaded, that we might be living in a virtual environment at this very moment. So we'll close with this. I think that this is interesting. Bostrom is a philosopher at Oxford, and he came up with this argument that he calls a simulation argument. And the argument is supposed to be that one of three things are true. So he claims that either we lose interest in building simulated worlds, or the human race goes extinct before it can build advanced simulated worlds, or we live in a simulation right now. So the argument is supposed to show that one of these three things are true, and he doesn't really say for himself which one that he thinks is true, but that he thinks that we should distribute our belief amongst these three options, and we'll talk about what he means by that in a second. But notice that this is a very interesting idea, and it depends, even to get started, on something like computationalism being possible, at least, if not true. Because if biologicalism is true, and according to the biologicalist, if you simulate the brain, you don't get consciousness because you need actual brain stuff. You need something juicy and chemical, or something bloody, or we don't know what, but we need something brain to have consciousness. Then you can't get it in a simulation. And if that's the case, then we don't live in a simulation now. And Bostrom is aware that this is a possibility. So he's merely claiming that, look, it's possible that, given the arguments that we just looked at, it's not impossible that conscious beings exist completely virtually. You replace your neurons with a computer chip, and then you have that simulated in a computer program, and then you have the thing virtually there. So you could have it in the meat body doing something, but you could have it totally virtually as well. The same arguments apply. So that seems possible. And his claim is, okay, so then one of these three things have to be true, if that's possible. And of course, the first two are the kinds of defeaters, and Chalmers was mentioning this as well. So, people say absent defeaters. Well, what are the defeaters? Well, here's a big one. We go extinct. So some people are pessimists about this, and if you look around into the galaxy, and now we know there are hundreds of thousands of galaxies, so if you look into the universe, we don't find a lot of life. We find a lot of harsh conditions, and of course that might just mean we haven't found it yet. That's a possibility. But some people have speculated that possibly the explanation for that is that we haven't found other advanced life forms, at least anyway. That an explanation for that might be that simply when life forms get advanced enough to do the kinds of things that we're doing now, they end up destroying themselves. And of course, probably the vast majority of life forms go extinct. And extinction is something that happens all the time here on the planet. And we think it's a terrible thing, and it is when you lose a species, but it's happening like every second of every day. There's a species that's going extinct. And so we don't want to be one of those species, obviously, but it's possible that the reason you don't see a lot of life in the universe, advanced as ours, is that by the time you get advanced enough to travel in space, you've built computers and blown yourself up with nuclear weapons or something like that. So some people say, look, look what we're doing. We're playing around with super viruses. We're playing around with black holes in the laboratory, building robots that who knows if we'll lose control of. And so some people say, look, we'll just kill ourselves before we ever build artificial intelligence. And so one reason why we might not be living in a simulation is that, we go extinct. Now, of course, another reason that we might not be living in a simulation is that we just stop messing around with simulations. This is the we lose interest category. So we lose interest. Why would we lose interest? Oh, because maybe we decide this is too dangerous. And so the world passes a ban on experimenting with artificial intelligence. That could happen, right? In America, they don't like stem cells. And so there was a prohibition against doing that kind of research. Maybe that happens on a global scale with AI. We don't know. Now, of course, many people don't think that's going to happen because if we stop doing it, other people will continue doing it, and you'll get something like an AI arms race. Worst case scenarios, one of our enemies gets artificial intelligence and uses it to build better weapons, and then comes and takes over us. So some people in the military are paranoid about that, and therefore they think we need to develop this first. And I wouldn't be surprised if the military is on the forefront of developing artificial intelligence, if and when it does get developed. So the we lose interest possibility is a possibility. Some people think it's not very likely that we're going to lose interest. We as a species in general seem very interested in developing this kind of ability, the ability to generate artificially intelligent things. So Bostrom says, okay, I don't think either of those two options are likely or as likely as, well, actually, I don't know if that's what he says, but some people think, just suppose, for the argument's sake, to see the structure of it, that those two first things don't come true. So one or the other of them turn out to be false, right? If one of those things is true, there will be no technological singularity. So let's imagine that both of them are false. So let's imagine that the first one is false. The first one is that we go extinct before we build simulated worlds. So if that's false, then we don't go extinct and we continue building simulated worlds. That's what the second thing says. It says we don't lose interest. So we continue on the track that we're on now, building ever more advanced simulations of the world that we live in, and we're building more and more and more of these things. So, think of the Sims. You think of, artificial intelligence research where they're doing artificial evolution. We're building more and more of, and various levels of degrees of complexity, but we're just generating more and more of these things. And so Bostrom's claim is that if you extrapolate into the future, and something like Moore's law stays on its trajectory, whether that's classical computation, quantum computation, spintronics, or whatever future version of computer science gets developed, if computational power keeps developing in the way that it does, then in the future, computation is going to be very, very cheap, and it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, right? People envision paper that's a computer, and it's as powerful as any computer is now, but it's just as thin as a sheet of paper and as disposable. That's what this is predicting. If computation gets that cheap, then at some point running ancestor simulations, simulating real people with conscious lives is going to be so inexpensive computationally that the number of simulated worlds is going to vastly outnumber the number of actual meat space worlds. There's only one non-simulated world, but at some point there's going to be millions of simulated worlds. So Bostrom's idea is if we don't go extinct, and if we don't lose interest in simulating people, actual conscious beings in simulated environments, then the chances are probably already the singularity has happened and we live in such a simulated environment. And the reasoning is just based on probabilistic reasoning. It's just much more likely that any given conscious creature is in a simulated environment than in the special non-simulated environment. So you have this hierarchy of simulations, all these simulated environments, and now, of course, now the idea here is not that this is true, but what should your distribution of beliefs be? So here's where we'll end. Here's Bostrom's own view. Here's a quote from his website. He says, quote, "Personally, I assign less than 50% probability to the simulation hypothesis. Rather something like in the 20% region, perhaps maybe. However, this estimate is a subjective personal opinion and is not part of the simulation argument. My reason is that I believe that we lack strong evidence for or against any of the three of the claims, 1 through 3. So it makes sense to assign each of them a significant probability." So now notice this is a fairly radical claim that Bostrom is making here. So if you go back and you read Descartes, for example, and Descartes says this may be a dreamlike reality where no physical objects exist, and in which an evil genius is deceiving us to believe that there are physical objects and so forth and so on. And Descartes says, this is a slight and metaphysical possibility. So he does say that you can't rule it out with certainty unless you invoke God, and there's a whole homina blah there. But he does say that you can't rule it out with certainty. But he also says, look, I'm also aware that the possibility here is such a small one that, it's only being used to illustrate that we lack certainty, not that I think there's any great degree of probability here. A slight and metaphysical chance. That's a quote from Descartes' Meditations. Notice Bostrom's argument is no slight and metaphysical chance. 20% or so is not a slight and metaphysical chance. That's a 1 in 5 chance. 1 in 5 chance that we live in the matrix, that's a pretty severe conclusion, much more startling than that this is a dream world and there's some small, probably minuscule, infinitely tiny possibility that this is a dream right now. So that was Descartes' reasoning. This is much more dramatic. 1 in 5 that we live in the matrix. 1 in 5 that we go extinct before we build something that's artificially intelligent. So if you're an optimist about artificial intelligence and you believe that, some people say things like 2029, we're going to turn on the blue brain and say, how do you do, simulated brain? What should we call you? So if this is right, then 1 in 5 chance that before 2029 human beings are extinct. That's pretty dramatic. Or 1 in 5 chance that we as a species decide to lose interest. Maybe, before 2029, we build something that scares the ever-loving bejeebus out of us, and we as a group of people declare that we will not allow this to happen. So now, one of those 3 things has to be true, or excuse me, we should believe that one of those 3 things are true according to Bostrom's argument. And I'll just end with this. It's important, that little mistake that I just made. It's not the case that one of these 3 things has to be true, right? We could be living in a world that's meat and biologicalism is true and you can't get consciousness that's simulated. Bostrom's question is, okay, that could be the case metaphysically, but what if you want to know what you should believe, then what are the odds that we're biological creatures and that consciousness depends on that we are a biological instantiation of the thing that makes consciousness? So if you believe that consciousness is possible in a virtual world, then you run this argument. One of these three things has to be true. And you might think, well, even if you don't believe it, if we build something that imitates conscious behavior and imitates deliberative decision making, and whether it really is thinking and understanding, if it can make decisions and act in the real world, then this kind of question is an important question, because whether we live in a completely simulated world or whether we live in some kind of matrix type simulated world where you have to have some bodies and brains around in order to pull the simulation off. Whatever kind of world that this turns out to be, whether we are living in a virtual environment is an important question, and whether you can actually come to a justified belief that there's a 1 in 5 chance that we live in a simulated world on the basis of a priori reasoning about the possibilities that we've been talking about, some people find very startling and very surprising. And I will end it with that. And thank you for joining me in this class, this series of lectures in a discussion of philosophy of mind. I hope that you have found them useful.